You think those scars are supposed to impress somebody, Bennett? Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson's voice cut across the Georgia training field just as the morning formation began to loosen after the obstacle course. A few soldiers turned before Rachel Bennett did. At 34, Rachel was older than most of the people around her, a prior service soldier completing a required requalification program at an installation better known for basic training. She had finished the course without celebration, crossed the final timber wall, landed in the red Georgia dirt, and walked toward the water station as if completing it had been nothing more than another item on a schedule. Then her sleeve caught against the strap of her training gear. The fabric pulled upward. For perhaps 2 seconds, several pale scars became visible along her left upper arm and shoulder. They were old, irregular, and faded enough that Rachel clearly had no interest in displaying them. She calmly freed the fabric and pulled her sleeve back into place. Dawson had already seen them. "What happened?" he asked, walking closer. "Lose an argument with a fence?" A nervous laugh came from somewhere behind him. Another followed. Rachel lifted her canteen, took a measured drink, and replaced the cap. "No, Staff Sergeant." Dawson waited for more. Nothing came. The silence seemed to bother him more than an excuse would have. "That is it. You asked a question. I answered it." Several smiles vanished. Dawson folded his arms. He was 32, sharp-featured, disciplined, and accustomed to controlling the rhythm of every conversation on his training field. Rachel's calm did not look defiant, but it did not look intimidated either. That made her difficult to place. "People come through here with all kinds of stories," he said. "Everybody wants to look tougher than they are." Rachel met his eyes. "I did not tell you a story." The wind moved across the open field, carrying the dry smell of pine and warm dirt. A range flag snapped against its pole. Dawson glanced at her covered shoulder. "No, you just made sure everybody saw the advertisement." Rachel's expression did not change. She adjusted the strap on her gear. "My sleeve caught, Staff Sergeant." "Convenient." A few soldiers shifted uneasily. Nobody laughed this time. 40 feet away, Sergeant First Class Andrew Collins stood beside a folding table covered with training rosters and equipment cards. He had heard Dawson's first joke without paying much attention. Instructors tested people. Sometimes they pushed too far. Usually the moment passed. Then Collins had seen Rachel's shoulder. His pencil stopped halfway across a name on the roster. He looked again, but Rachel had already covered the scars. Something about their placement bothered him. Not because scars were unusual in the Army. They were not. It was the pattern. One mark disappeared beneath the edge of her shirt near the shoulder. 2 others ran at angles that stirred an old memory Collins could not immediately identify. He had seen something similar before. Not on a training field. Not in any ordinary medical briefing. Dawson pointed toward the next station. "Get back in formation, Bennett. Whatever those marks are supposed to mean, nobody here is impressed." "Understood." Rachel turned and walked away. No anger. No embarrassment. No attempt to defend herself. Collins watched her cover the 40 feet toward the formation. She checked the lane ahead without moving her head much. Then the building entrance. Then the open ground beyond the obstacle course. 3 quick points of awareness so natural that nobody else appeared to notice. Collins did. His gaze returned to Rachel's shoulder. The half-remembered image in his mind sharpened just enough to make him uncomfortable. He slowly lowered the roster. "Why," he murmured, "is someone carrying scars like those standing here?" By mid-morning, the Georgia sun had burned through the last trace of cool air, and heat shimmered above the packed dirt as the soldiers moved toward the next training lane. Rachel Bennett took her place without looking toward Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson. If his comments had bothered her, nothing in her posture showed it. Sergeant First Class Andrew Collins remained near the rear of the group, carrying his roster but no longer reading it. His attention had shifted from Rachel's scars to the woman carrying them. The next exercise tested observation, communication, and movement through a simulated field position. Dawson explained the route, pointed out the boundaries, and gave the group 5 minutes to complete the task. Rachel listened with everyone else. She did not ask questions. She did not volunteer. When the exercise began, She was not the fastest person in the group. A 22-year-old soldier reached the first checkpoint several seconds ahead of her, and another climbed the low barrier with more speed. Rachel seemed completely unconcerned. She moved economically, never wasting a step. At the first intersection, the group started toward the obvious route. Rachel glanced once toward a drainage channel on the right. "That lane narrows ahead," she said quietly. "Left gives us more room." One soldier hesitated. Then an instructor called a change in the exercise that closed the narrow route. Rachel was already moving left. Dawson noticed. "Lucky guess, Bennett?" "Maybe, Staff Sergeant." The answer irritated him because she sounded as though she genuinely did not care whether he believed her. 10 minutes later, the group reached a mock command position beside a low concrete building. Everyone faced the instructor. Rachel positioned herself where she could see both the doorway and the open field without appearing to think about it. Collins noticed that too. Then her eyes moved toward the southeast. Nothing was there except pine trees and pale blue sky. "Eyes front," Dawson called. Rachel obeyed. 7 seconds later, a faint rhythmic pulse rolled over the trees. Rotor blades. A military helicopter appeared in the distance, moving west several hundred feet above the tree line. 2 soldiers looked up. Dawson looked at Rachel. She had heard it before any of them. "You expecting that aircraft?" he asked. "No, Staff Sergeant." "Then how did you know it was there?" Rachel paused. "I heard it." Dawson gave a humorless smile. "Nobody else did." "You asked how I knew." Collins watched the exchange carefully. Rachel was not trying to impress anyone. That was becoming the strangest part. People showing off usually checked to see whether others had noticed. Rachel never did. During the next drill, an instructor deliberately introduced conflicting instructions to test how the group handled confusion. Voices overlapped. Several soldiers stopped and waited for clarification. Rachel did not raise her voice. She listened, looked once at the terrain, and moved to a position where she could see the instructor, the group, and the nearest exit at the same time. It lasted only seconds. Most people would have missed it. Collins had spent more than 20 years watching soldiers under pressure. He knew the difference between someone remembering a lesson and someone obeying an instinct. At the water break, Dawson approached him. "She is trying too hard." Collins looked across the field. Rachel was tightening one bootlace. Before standing, her eyes swept the road, the building entrance, and the tree line. "No," Collins said. Dawson frowned. "No what?" "She is not trying at all." Rachel rose and returned to formation. Collins watched her go. "That is what bothers me." Dawson crossed his arms. "You think she is special because she can hear a helicopter?" Collins finally looked at him. "I think people can practice drills. They can practice procedures. They can practice looking confident." He glanced back toward Rachel. "But habits like hers usually come from doing something so many times that the body stops asking permission." A whistle sounded from the next lane. Dawson turned toward the formation, his expression tightening. Collins felt the same half-formed memory from earlier pressing closer to the surface. He still could not place those scars. But he was beginning to understand something more important. Rachel Bennett was not learning how to observe the training field. She was trying to remember how not to observe everything. The whistle sent the group toward the final training block before lunch, but Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson barely watched the others anymore. His attention kept returning to Rachel Bennett. The more ordinary she tried to appear, the less ordinary she seemed. She never challenged him openly. She never boasted. She never offered the kind of explanation he could dismiss. By the time the soldiers assembled, beside a row of wooden barriers for equipment inspection, Dawson's curiosity had hardened into irritation. "Bennett." Rachel turned her head. "Staff Sergeant." "Step forward." She did. The formation became quiet. Sergeant First Class Andrew Collins stood 30 feet away beside the training table, and the moment he heard Dawson's tone, he stopped writing. Dawson walked slowly around Rachel, studying her gear. Everything was correct. Boots tied. Equipment secured. Uniform squared away. Nothing to criticize. His eyes settled instead on her left shoulder. "You know what I cannot figure out," he said. Rachel waited. You have spent all morning acting like this place is beneath you. I have followed every instruction you gave me. That is not what I said. Then I do not know what you want me to say. Dawson gave a short laugh. There. That attitude. Several soldiers exchanged glances. Rachel's face remained still. I am here to complete requalification, Staff Sergeant. Nothing more. Prior service does not make you different from anyone else on this field. I never said it did. Dawson stepped closer. No. You let people fill in the blanks. Collins began moving toward them. He recognized what was happening. Dawson was no longer correcting performance. He was trying to win an argument Rachel had never agreed to have. Those scars this morning, Dawson continued. You want everyone wondering where they came from? Rachel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. No. Then tell us. They're not relevant. Not relevant? Dawson pointed toward the place where the edge of one pale scar disappeared beneath the fabric near her shoulder. You walk around with something like that and expect nobody to ask? Asking is different from deciding what the answer must be. The words were quiet, but the formation heard them. Dawson's jaw tightened. So, what is the answer? Rachel looked directly at him. Private. The wind lifted dust between their boots. Somewhere beyond the training lanes, a truck shifted gears on the access road. Collins was less than 15 feet away now. Dawson, he called. It was a warning. Dawson glanced at him, then back at Rachel. I am trying to understand what kind of soldier I am training. Then train the soldier standing in front of you. For the first time, Dawson had no immediate reply. His hand rose again, indicating the scar near her shoulder. And that is supposed to mean nothing? Rachel followed his gesture. Her eyes dropped. Her right hand moved before she seemed aware of it, fingertips resting lightly against the fabric covering the old mark. The training field changed. Not visibly. Not for anyone else. But the sharp whistle from a distant lane stretched thin in Rachel's hearing until it became something electronic. The warm wind disappeared beneath the remembered vibration of rotor blades. Georgia's sunlight dimmed into red illumination moving across metal walls. Her breathing slowed. Dawson was still speaking, but his words seemed to come from far away. Rachel saw no formation now. She saw anonymous figures seated beneath red cabin lights. No visible names. No unit patches. A radio hissed somewhere beside her. Static broke, cleared, then carried a voice she had not heard in years. Package compromised. Rachel's fingers tightened against her shoulder. Another voice followed, closer this time. Bennett, leave them. Her lips parted. The answer came from memory before the present could stop it. Not while somebody is still out there. Collins froze. Dawson's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion. Rachel blinked once, and the Georgia training field returned in a rush of heat, dust, pine, and staring faces. She lowered her hand. Are we finished, Staff Sergeant? Dawson stared at her, suddenly uncertain. Collins was not looking at Rachel's scars anymore. He was looking at her face. He had heard those words. More importantly, he had heard the phrase before them. Package compromised. Somewhere deep in his memory, a locked door had just opened. For 17 seconds, Rachel Bennett was no longer standing beneath the Georgia sun. The heat vanished first. Then the smell of pine and dry earth. The voices around her stretched into distant echoes until only the low mechanical rhythm remained. Rotor blades. Steady. Heavy. Familiar. She was years younger again, seated beneath dim red cabin. Lights inside an aircraft that carried no visible unit markings. No names appeared on the equipment around her. No shoulder patches identified the people seated across from her. Even the usual casual conversation was absent. Everyone spoke only when there was something worth saying. Rachel remembered the vibration beneath her boots and the cold metal against one hand as the aircraft changed direction. A voice came through her headset. 3 minutes. She checked the dark window, then the people around her. One man gave a small nod. Another adjusted a radio and stared at the floor. Rachel looked toward the rear of the cabin and counted automatically. The memory jumped without warning. Now the aircraft was waiting. Radio traffic overlapped in clipped fragments. Static filled the gaps. Someone repeated coordinates. Another voice answered too quickly. Then came the phrase that had followed Rachel into dreams for years. Package compromised. She remembered turning toward the open darkness beyond the aircraft. The team was returning, but the count was wrong. She counted again. Still wrong. "We are short," she said. A man near the doorway checked his watch. "Bennett, we cannot stay here." Rachel looked past him. Somebody is still out there. The rotor beat seemed louder now, each pulse measuring time they did not have. A second voice came through her headset. "Bennett, leave them." She remembered the strange calm that settled over her then. No dramatic speech. No thought of recognition. Only a simple fact that outweighed everything else. Someone had not returned. Not while somebody is still out there. The memory shifted again. Rachel was moving through darkness, guided more by sound and timing than sight. A radio clicked once. Then twice. She answered with a single click. Somewhere behind her, the aircraft continued waiting. She remembered hearing someone say her name. She remembered finding movement where there should have been none. Then the memory fractured. Red light. A hand gripping a metal rail. A voice counting people as they came aboard. One missing. Then none missing. The next image came days later. Rachel sat in a quiet room beneath fluorescent lights, while a man in an unmarked uniform placed a sealed folder on the table between them. "What happened does not follow you home," he said. Rachel looked at the medical dressing beneath the edge of her shirt near her shoulder. "Some of it does." The man had no answer. The memory released her. Georgia returned in pieces. Heat against her face. Dust beneath her boots. The distant whistle of another instructor. Rachel realized her fingers were still pressed against the scar beneath her uniform. She lowered her hand. Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson stood in front of her, but his earlier certainty had disappeared. Sergeant First Class Andrew Collins was several steps behind him, completely still. Rachel drew one slow breath. "Package compromised," she whispered, not realizing the words had escaped her memory. Collins heard them clearly. His expression changed. Years earlier, before an overseas assignment, he had attended a restricted security briefing in a windowless room where every telephone had been left outside. Most of the presentation had faded from memory. One phrase had not. Package compromised. It had appeared beside a program identifier for less than 10 seconds before the briefing officer removed the slide. Collins had asked what the identifier meant. The officer had given him an answer he never forgot. "If you ever meet someone connected to that program, Sergeant, you probably will not know it." Collins looked at Rachel Bennett standing quietly in the Georgia dust. For the first time, he wondered if he had just met someone he was never supposed to recognize. The training schedule continued, but Sergeant First Class Andrew Collins carried the words with him long after Rachel Bennett returned to formation. Package compromised. He had heard military phrases repeated so often that most became background noise, but this one belonged to a different memory. Collins waited until Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson moved the group toward the next lane. Then he crossed the field toward the administration building without explaining why. The temperature dropped sharply when he stepped inside. Fluorescent lights hummed above a narrow hallway lined with unit photographs, safety notices, and framed certificates. Collins entered the personnel office, identified himself, and sat at an authorized workstation. He did not search for secrets. He requested exactly what his duties allowed him to review: Rachel Bennett's prior service information connected to her requalification assignment. The first screen was ordinary. Name, age, current status, medical clearance, previous assignments, training requirements. Nothing explained the woman he had watched outside. Collins moved through the service timeline slowly. Then he found the gap. Several months of Rachel's career were represented by almost nothing. No location. No normal assignment history. Only a brief administrative entry followed by a notice stating that additional command security authorization was required. Collins leaned toward the monitor. "There you are," he murmured. He selected the permitted request option and entered his official reason for inquiry. The system processed for several seconds. A small identifier appeared near the restricted period before the page refreshed. 2 letters and a number. Collins stopped breathing for a moment. He knew that sequence. Not completely. Not enough to explain it. But enough to remember the windowless briefing room from years earlier. The collected telephones. The security officer at the door. The slide that remained visible for less than 10 seconds. The same identifier had been printed in one corner beside language. Collins had been instructed never to discuss outside authorized channels. He remembered asking the briefing officer whether the program involved a special unit. The answer had been immediate. Do not build theories around things you are not cleared to know. Collins had taken the advice. Until now. He looked again at Rachel's record. The identifier was gone. In its place was a plain notice. Further access requires command security authorization. That was enough. Collins removed his hand from the mouse. Whatever existed beyond that message was not his to uncover. He picked up the office telephone and called command security. Sergeant First Class Collins speaking. I need guidance on a prior service record connected to requalification. Training. The security specialist asked for the name. Rachel Bennett. Keys clicked through the receiver. Then stopped. What information are you requesting? I am not requesting restricted information. I need to know whether I should document an incident involving the soldier. What kind of incident? Collins glanced toward the closed door. An instructor questioned old scars on her shoulder. During the exchange, Sergeant Bennett appeared to recall something and repeated a phrase. The specialist's voice became more careful. What phrase? Collins lowered his own. Package compromised. Silence. Not static. Not a dropped connection. Silence from a person who had suddenly decided every next word mattered. Sergeant First Class Collins, do not access that record again. Understood. Do not ask Sergeant Bennett about the restricted period. Collins straightened. Understood. And keep the instructor from questioning her about those scars until you receive further guidance. Collins looked through the narrow office window toward the distant training field. Is there a problem? The specialist paused. I cannot answer that. Another voice became faintly audible on the far end of the line. The specialist returned seconds later. Stay available. This is being elevated. The call ended. Collins remained seated, staring at the receiver. Outside, Rachel Bennett was probably completing another ordinary training exercise under the Georgia sun. Inside, one legitimate personnel inquiry had just reached a security channel Collins had not expected to touch. He finally understood why the missing months bothered him. The record was not incomplete. The silence inside it had been placed there deliberately. Andrew Collins had barely returned the telephone to its cradle when it rang again. He answered on the first tone. Sergeant First Class Collins. A different voice responded, calm and precise. This is Captain Robert Hayes, Command Security. Confirm you are in a private office. Collins looked at the closed door. Confirmed, sir. Tell me exactly what happened with Sergeant Bennett. No conclusions. Only what you personally observed. Collins described the morning from the beginning. Rachel's scars becoming visible after the obstacle course, Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson's questions, her unusual pause when Dawson pointed toward her shoulder, and the words she had spoken afterward. Hayes interrupted only once. The scars. Which shoulder? Left, sir. Upper arm into the shoulder area. I only saw part of the pattern. Silence followed. Collins could hear a keyboard at the other end. Did Sergeant Bennett explain where she got them? No, sir. Did Staff Sergeant Dawson continue pressing her? Yes, sir. That ends now. Hayes's tone remained controlled. You will not ask Sergeant Bennett about the scars or the restricted period in her service history. Dawson will not ask either. Do you understand? Yes, sir. One more thing. Her current status in the requalification program lists her as Sergeant Bennett. Make sure Staff Sergeant Dawson understands that prior service is not a rumor he gets to interpret. Collins glanced through the office window toward the distant field. Understood. Hayes paused. Stay available. The line went dead. Collins had taken only 3 steps toward the door when Captain Hayes placed another call from his own office. That call reached a colonel at brigade headquarters. The colonel listened, asked for Rachel's full name, then requested the exact phrase Collins had reported. Package compromised, Hayes repeated. The colonel stopped writing. And the soldier is Rachel Bennett? Yes, sir. Do not question her further. Do not attempt additional access. I will handle the notification. Within minutes, the matter moved again, not because anyone was chasing a mystery, but because the restricted record carried instructions Collins could not see. The next call went to a protected command office at another Army installation in Georgia. Major General William Mercer was reviewing readiness reports when an aide entered and placed a single sheet beside his folder. Sir, this came through a restricted personnel notification. Mercer continued reading for another second. Then he saw the name. Rachel Bennett. His hand stopped. Where is she? At a training installation in Georgia, sir. Prior service. Requalification. Mercer looked up slowly. Who questioned her? A staff sergeant. Apparently, he noticed scars near her left shoulder and pressed her about them. Something changed behind Mercer's eyes. Did she answer? Not directly. A sergeant first class reported that she repeated a phrase during the exchange. Mercer already seemed to know what the aide was going to say. Which phrase? Package compromised. The office became silent. Mercer leaned back, his attention no longer on the reports before him. For several seconds, he looked toward the window without seeing the afternoon outside it. Then he asked, How old is she now? 34, sir. Mercer nodded once, almost to himself. And she is there voluntarily for requalification? Yes, sir. Mercer closed the folder on his desk. Tell Brigade Command that Sergeant Bennett is not to be questioned about that period of service. No one is to discuss her restricted record on the training field. The aide wrote quickly. Yes, sir. And the instructor? Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson. Mercer repeated the name once, then stood. Have transportation ready. The aide looked up. Sir. Mercer picked up his uniform jacket. My afternoon meeting can be moved. Are you going to the training installation? Mercer looked again at Rachel Bennett's name. The controlled expression of a general disappeared for just a moment, replaced by something older and deeply personal. There are some soldiers you remember because they served under you, he said quietly. And there are some you remember because everyone came home. Major General William Mercer remained standing after his aide left, one hand resting on the closed readiness folder as a memory older than most of the officers outside his door returned with impossible clarity. Years earlier, Mercer had worn lieutenant colonel insignia and carried responsibilities that never appeared in public photographs. He remembered an aircraft moving through a moonless sky, its interior washed in dim red light. There were no visible unit patches among the small group aboard. Names were spoken only when necessary. Rachel Bennett sat several feet from him, younger than, quiet even. By the standards of the people around her, Mercer had noticed how often she counted. Personnel. Equipment. Time. She checked everything twice without seeming to check anything at all. A voice came through their headsets. 3 minutes. The aircraft changed direction. Rachel looked toward the dark window. Then the memory jumped forward. They were waiting for the final members of the group to return. Radio traffic had become uneven. Static filled long spaces between clipped messages. Mercer checked his watch. Their window was narrowing. One figure returned. Then another. Rachel counted. Mercer saw the answer in her face before she spoke. We are short. Someone near the rear told her the missing personnel knew the contingency procedure. Another voice warned that the aircraft could not remain much longer. Rachel looked into the darkness beyond the doorway. Somebody is still out there. Mercer remembered giving the instruction himself. Bennett, leave them. We have to move. Rachel turned toward him. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. That was what Mercer remembered most. Not while somebody is still out there, sir. Then she went back. Mercer had spent the following minutes watching the second hand on his watch move while the aircraft waited. Every instinct told him the window had closed. Then movement appeared beyond the darkness. Rachel returned with the missing personnel. One count became another. Mercer counted again. Nobody was missing. Only after everyone was aboard did he notice Rachel holding her left arm differently. She dismissed the concern with 2 words. I am fine. Days later, Mercer saw her outside a secure briefing room. The The shoulder was covered, her service record already being separated from the operation that had created those missing months. There would be no public ceremony connected to that night. No newspaper story. No photograph of the team. The mission would be reduced to restricted reports, compartmented access, and memories carried by the people who had been there. Mercer had asked one official what recognition Bennett would receive. The answer had been careful. Recognition creates questions. Questions create records. Mercer had hated the logic, even while understanding it. Before Rachel left the installation, he found her alone near a row of government vehicles. "People should know what you did," he told her. Rachel looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried into the darkness. The people who needed to come home came home, sir. That had been enough for her. It had never been enough for him. The present returned as Mercer's aide re-entered the office. "Transportation will be ready in 10 minutes, sir. The training installation is approximately 90 minutes away." Mercer nodded and reached for his jacket. "Has Brigade Command contacted Sergeant Bennett?" "No, sir. For your instruction, they are leaving her alone." "Good." Mercer walked toward the door, then stopped. "And make sure nobody turns this into a ceremony." The aide looked surprised. "Yes, sir." Mercer glanced back at the sheet bearing Rachel's name. She never wanted one. 90 minutes away, beneath the Georgia afternoon sun, Rachel Bennett stood in formation while Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson struggled to understand why command had suddenly ordered him to stop asking questions. He still believed the scars were the mystery. Mercer knew better. The scars were only what remained visible. The real story was that years ago, when leaving would have been easier, Rachel Bennett had counted the people around her, realized someone was missing, and refused to accept an empty place on the flight home. The late afternoon sun had turned the training field amber when 2 government vehicles appeared on the access road beyond the Georgia pines. Gravel crackled beneath their tires. Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson looked toward the road, then towards Sergeant First Class Andrew Collins. "You expecting somebody?" Collins kept his eyes on the approaching vehicles. No. That was true, although he had begun to suspect the afternoon was no longer following an ordinary training schedule. The vehicles stopped beside the administration building. An aide stepped out first. Then Major General William Mercer emerged from the second vehicle. Dawson straightened instantly. Formation, attention. Boots settled against the dirt. Conversations vanished. Rachel Bennett came to attention with everyone else, her face unreadable beneath the fading sunlight. Mercer crossed the field at an unhurried pace. Dawson moved forward to meet him. "Major General Mercer, Staff Sergeant Dawson." "Welcome, sir." "We were not notified of an inspection." Mercer did not stop. "This is not an inspection." For words, calmly delivered. Dawson turned as the general walked past him. Mercer passed Collins next, giving him a brief nod of acknowledgement, then continued toward the formation. His eyes moved across the soldiers once and stopped on Rachel. He did not look at her shoulder. He did not need to. "Sergeant Bennett." Rachel's composure shifted for the smallest fraction of a second. She recognized the voice before she fully met his eyes. "Sir." Dawson looked from Mercer to Rachel. "Sergeant Bennett. Not simply Bennett. Not a recruit with a questionable story. Not someone whose prior service existed only as an unexplained line on a training roster." Mercer stopped several feet in front of her. The Georgia wind moved through the trees behind them. "It has been a long time," he said. "Yes, sir." "How long?" Rachel considered the question. "Long enough that I hoped nobody would count." A faint expression crossed Mercer's face, almost a smile, but weighted by memory. "You always counted." Rachel said nothing. Collins understood the words differently now. He remembered watching her scan terrain that morning, measuring exits, noticing aircraft, tracking people without appearing to do any of it. Mercer lowered his voice. "I heard there were questions about your service." Rachel glanced briefly toward Dawson. There was a misunderstanding. Dawson's face tightened. She could have embarrassed him with one sentence. She chose not to. Mercer noticed. "You still protect people who make things difficult for you." "I am not protecting anyone, sir. I just do not think the past needs an audience." Mercer studied her for a moment, Then his gaze finally moved to the edge of the pale scar barely visible near her left shoulder. The years between them seemed to collapse. Red cabin lights. A narrowing extraction window. An empty place. That Rachel had refused to leave empty. When Mercer spoke again, his voice was barely above the wind. The Black Ops survivor. Dawson heard it. Collins heard it. So did the nearest soldiers in formation. Nobody moved. Rachel's eyes held Mercer's. I survived, sir. So did everyone else. Mercer nodded slowly. Because you counted. The words settled across the field with more weight than any formal citation could have carried. Dawson stared at Rachel as the assumptions of the entire day rearranged themselves in silence. The scars he had mocked were no longer the most important thing about her. They had never been. Mercer stepped back and straightened. For what it is worth, Sergeant Bennett, some of us never forgot. Rachel's voice softened. That is worth more than you think, sir. Mercer gave one quiet nod. No ceremony followed. No classified history was announced. No details were offered to satisfy the curiosity surrounding them. The general had traveled 90 minutes for something simpler. He had come to make sure that one soldier who had once refused to leave others behind would not be left standing alone beneath someone else's assumptions. For several seconds after Major General William Mercer finished speaking, the training field remained silent. The only sound came from the wind moving through the Georgia pines and the faint rattle of a range flag against its pole. Rachel Bennett stood exactly as she had before the vehicles arrived. No smile of triumph. No glance toward the soldiers who had laughed that morning. No satisfaction in watching Staff Sergeant Mark Dawson struggle with what he had just learned. Mercer understood. He had known Rachel long enough to recognize that she had never needed another person diminished in order to stand taller herself. He turned toward Dawson. Staff Sergeant. Dawson straightened. Sir. Mercer studied him for a moment. Standards matter. Yes, sir. Discipline matters. Yes, sir. So does judgment. Dawson's jaw tightened. Understood, sir. Mercer glanced toward Rachel, then back at him. You are responsible for evaluating what soldiers do. Be careful when you start believing that gives you authority to invent who they are. Dawson lowered his eyes for a fraction of a second. Yes, sir. Mercer did not raise his voice. He did not threaten consequences or turn the moment into a public spectacle. He simply nodded to Rachel, returned to the waiting vehicle, and left the field with the same quiet purpose that had brought him there. Gravel crackled beneath the tires until the vehicles disappeared beyond the trees. Training resumed 20 minutes later. At first, the soldiers treated Rachel differently. Some avoided looking at her. Others watched with the uncomfortable curiosity reserved for questions they knew they should not ask. Rachel ignored both. She checked her equipment and walked toward the obstacle lane. Dawson intercepted her before she reached the starting point. This time his voice carried none of the edge from that morning. Sergeant Bennett. Rachel stopped. Staff Sergeant. Dawson took a breath. I owe you an apology. She waited. I made assumptions about your scars. Then I made assumptions about you. I was wrong. Rachel looked at him steadily. Yes, you were. The answer surprised him, but there was no cruelty in it. Dawson nodded. I did not know what happened. You were not supposed to know. Then what should I have done? Rachel glanced toward the formation waiting near the course. Train what you can see. Do not invent what you cannot. Dawson absorbed the words. Fair enough. Rachel adjusted her sleeve, covering the last visible edge of the scar near her shoulder. We have a training schedule, Staff Sergeant. Something almost like embarrassment crossed Dawson's face. Yes, Sergeant Bennett. We do. She returned to the line. The next obstacle was a wooden wall standing several feet above the red dirt. Rachel crossed it without being the fastest soldier on the field. She landed, recovered her balance, and continued toward the next station. Dawson watched. For the first time all day, his eyes never moved toward her shoulder. He watched her footwork. Her awareness. The way she waited half a second to let another soldier clear the lane before moving forward. Collins stood nearby with his roster beneath one arm. He noticed the change and said nothing. The restricted months in Rachel's record would remain restricted. The people on that field would never know the location of the aircraft, the purpose of the mission, or the names of those who had returned with her. They did not need to. Rachel had spent years carrying a story that belonged to very few people, and she had never asked the world to understand it. As the evening light stretched across the training ground, she moved toward the final obstacle with her scars hidden beneath an ordinary uniform. Some scars are not stories asking to be told. They are simply proof that someone kept going.